Forward by Rupert Lowe, MP. Evil seems good to him whose mind the god is driving towards disaster. Sophocles. As Charles Mackay once wrote, "Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one." We have seen this throughout history, with examples like the Mississippi Scheme in France, the South Sea Bubble in England, and tulip mania in Holland. Money is usually at the heart of it. But in the case of the self-harm inflicted upon Britain today by illogical energy policies now driven by Ed Miliband, the cause is a misguided ideology based around net zero and climate change. In this timely paper, we deal with the fallacies so regularly used to undermine Britain's economy and our self-respect on the world stage, all while China, India, and other countries exploit their coal, oil, gas, and other natural resources to grow their economies and raise the standard of living of their peoples. We are blessed to have the energy resources that geology has given us, and Norway, but the well-being, security, and prosperity of our people is being undermined by a government of Fabian fools who worship false gods. We must implement the solutions put forward by Restore Britain in this document if we are to revive our economy, protect our extraordinary skill pool of experts in places like Aberdeen, explore and recover our valuable oil and gas reserves, and take advantage of other domestically available sources of cheap energy. It is late in the day, but when combined with a sensible economic policy, we have the foundation of a durable national comeback, as well as a delivery of Brexit dividends that were voted for but never delivered. The British people's pioneering spirit will do the rest once our gift for enterprise is set free from suffocating mandates, arbitrary targets, and foolish constraints. Exciting times will return. Energy is the lifeblood of any developed first world economy. An abundance of energy makes for a prosperous nation. First and foremost, then, it should be cheap, reliable, competitive, and scalable. If that means investment in fossil fuels, as right now it does, then so be it. Affordable energy makes nations rich, and rich nations are better equipped than poor nations to tackle any environmental challenges. Our overall system diagnosis is that Britain today cannot convert resources into energy because we optimize for risk aversion, not output. We are governed by institutions that put process before delivery and compliance before capacity. Projects get delayed beyond their economic life, investors cannot count on stable returns, and regulatory layers multiply without accountability. Yet energy usage is the best proxy we have for real industrial capability. It measures the part of the economy that deal with the world of atoms rather than the world of bytes. If anything, we ought to regard kilowatt hour per capita divided by the cost per kilowatt hour as a more meaningful metric of national capability than GDP per capita. This would put China already ahead of the United States and even further ahead of us. In Britain and across the West, meanwhile, economic policy continues to be conducted by recourse to financial metrics. We get caught in a never-ending loop of conversations about GDP growth, productivity statistics, fiscal balances, and interest rates. The Chinese have optimized for the right variable in the same period that Western countries have increasingly optimized for abstract variables that distract us from the real world. At Restore Britain, we depart from this short-sighted model. Financial metrics are not the foundations of national capability. They are downstream indicators. The upstream drivers are at once simpler and more physical. A modern nation ultimately depends upon a small number of base inputs: people, food, and energy, the real stuff of economic life. Without people to work, food to sustain them, and energy to power machines, no amount of financial finesse can make a country prosperous. But once armed with a solid birth rate, human energy, a self-sustaining agriculture, biological energy, And with abundant, affordable power generation, industrial energy, everything else becomes a matter of speed and organization. An able, patriotic government should always aim to maximize the abundance and security of these base inputs. Of these, industrial energy is the master variable. Every single sector of a modern economy, manufacturing, construction, transport, computers, housing, and increasingly AI, is downstream of the energy system. When energy is plentiful and cheap, the entire lot performs better. When energy becomes scarce and expensive, economic productivity suffers. Overall, energy should be valued as strategic national infrastructure, not treated as an environmental compliance problem. The countries that will dominate the coming decades are unlikely to be those who optimize for financial efficiency. They will be the ones that secure abundance at the base layers of the system. An intelligent domestic energy policy has to be about more than just lowering prices. At Restore, we also believe that it must serve national security. In the modern world, sovereignty means next to nothing if it is not backed by energy independence. Foreign powers can own part of our energy infrastructure, subject to obvious security checks, because at this time we need all of the capital resources we can get. But it should always remain under our own legislative control so that we are never held to ransom by outside forces. The debate now raging about energy bills shows that the British people are struggling. Relative to our competitors, we pay through the nose for the power we need to function as a first world economy. This will not be solved by short-term thinking or fiddling with price caps on bills. Ultimately, what we need is not eye-catching measures aimed at temporary relief, but a long-term vision for national prosperity. This paper's remit. The focus of this paper is simple. Our aim is to present how a Restore Britain government would foster the conditions for cheap and abundant energy at home. The future we envision is one of full exploitation of our offshore oil and gas reserves, self-confident nuclear energy expansion, offshore shale development, and if viable, some limited role for renewables, albeit without subsidies, competing on their own merits as a part of a balanced grid mix. This should meet our nation's energy demands at a rate far more affordable to British households and businesses. On its own, though, this is not enough to make energy cheap and thus restore Britain to prosperity. We will also need to embark upon a mass removal of our binding net zero commitments, the vast majority of which are smothering our economy to no worthwhile end. This means canning the expensive but locked-in contracts that we already have with subsidised renewables companies. Given the present system of judicial review and the general importance of business confidence, this will require both legal finesse and diplomatic care. The ownership structure, reinforcement requirements, and storage needs of the national grid, along with associated transmission infrastructure, will be determined at a later stage. They lie beyond the remit of this paper. However, the total repeal of existing net zero legislation would, in itself, address a substantial proportion of these challenges. A Restore Britain government would also work to establish a system of dynamic energy pricing for both industrial and commercial users. As a result, electricity costs will more accurately reflect real-time supply and demand conditions. At present, a range of government interventions, particularly within commercial energy markets, including the energy price cap and cost recovery mechanisms associated with net zero objectives, serve to scramble the conditions within which economic decision-making occurs, allowing prices to vary more freely in accordance with periods of security and surplus. would improve the efficiency of the existing energy system by strengthening demand-side responsiveness. This would encourage consumption to shift away from peak periods, reducing system strain and improving overall utilization of generation and network infrastructure. These measures are intended to complement ongoing investment in grid expansion and modernization, with system efficiency gains reinforcing physical infrastructure improvements. Both commercial and industrial energy users would retain full flexibility to manage exposure to price volatility through private contractual arrangements, including fixed price contracts, indexed tariffs, and hedging instruments. This ensures that consumers can choose the level of price certainty or market exposure that best fits their needs. The objective is to ensure that pricing signals are transparent, market-driven, and capable of informing more efficient decision-making across the entire economy. Greater efficiency benefits everyone. A Restore Britain government would ensure that no government intervention distorts the true price of energy. But as for the more general debate between privatisation and nationalisation, we are not dogmatic either way. What works is best. Our objective is a responsible energy policy that puts Britain's interest first, not national suicide for the sake of increasingly expensive luxury benefits. Net zero self-harm. At Restore Britain, we do not deny some greenhouse gas effect. We simply note that as a matter of proportion, that carbon dioxide levels are at historic lows and reject the sensationalist claims that it should be treated as a kind of poison, not least because we would all be dead without it. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has been in a general trend of decline since the Eocene period some 51 million years ago. So alarmist notions that fluctuating levels of carbon dioxide as such pose an existential threat to life on Earth are scientifically baseless. More to the point, our own contribution to global emissions could hardly be more slender. Yet for too long the British state has put luxury benefits around net zero before the critical energy needs of British people. The Climate Change Act of 2008, expanded to devastating effect by Theresa May in 2019, should be abolished. This act has undermined Britain's national interests and distorted what would otherwise be productive market dynamics. It has given arbitrary privilege to the most expensive and intermittent energy sources, such as onshore wind and solar, while degrading the most cost-efficient and effective, such as oil, gas, and nuclear. The countries that have gambled most heavily on renewables, such as Germany, Denmark, and indeed Britain, have some of the highest energy prices in the world. Without the Green Crusade against our national prosperity, our energy could cost roughly a third of what we pay today. There are no natural barriers to cheap energy in Britain, only a history of poor government policy. In addition to the constraint and backup payments forced upon us by the drive for renewables at all costs, there is the vital matter of inertia. Inertia is crucial to keeping the grid stabilised. It was the lack of it that caused the Spanish blackout in 2025. This spread from Spain into Portugal, but it was stopped in France. The French spared themselves such blackouts because France enjoys a great deal of inertia, in no small part because nuclear power represents around 70% of the country's generation capacity. In Britain, meanwhile, we have no choice but to simulate with flywheels and by various other expensive methods the lack of inertia available in both wind and solar. Even if we were to opt for a full steam-ahead strategy on oil, gas, and nuclear right away, energy prices would not come down unless we first took aim at the structural issues caused by our legally binding net zero commitments. We would first abolish the burdensome climate change levy for the good of British families and industries. This is a tax that every business and by extension every household now pays on top of their actual energy usage in order to subsidise green projects. To fulfil our currently binding net zero commitments, the Climate Change Committee itself grants that we will be forced to spend an average of £26 billion per year on the decarbonisation crusade between now and 2050. This is before we even get onto the staggering opportunity cost incurred by undermining our car industry, our pottery industry, our chemical industry, and so on. In order to save ourselves this money, ease the burden on our economy, and reinvigorate our manufacturing base, we at Restore Britain commit to repealing the Climate Change Act of 2008. This would remove subsidies from supposedly world-saving projects that cannot even support themselves, bring an end to costly carbon capture and storage initiatives, and sweep aside other forms of expensive waste made mandatory by the existing system. Renewables at present are so expensive, we could, in principle, lose them all tomorrow without any real effect on the grid besides making it cheaper and stabler. The government misleads us with statistics in presenting the cost of net zero. Their use of levelised cost of electricity (LCOE) figures create a false impression of cheap renewables, while the actual price paid by households and businesses includes constraint payments, inertia and balancing services, grid reinforcement, and other system costs that are socialised across all electricity bills. British households and businesses do not pay a levelised cost. They pay the price that appears on their bills every month or quarter. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero admits as much itself, conceding that wider system costs beyond those faced by the developer lie outside of scope. That covers the levies that fund preferential contracts for difference, the balancing services, constraint payments, inertia provision, and grid upgrades required by intermittent renewables. All other metrics are secondary. It should be noted that levies that fund renewables obligation certificate payments for wind and solar generations represent substantially larger subsidiaries than those provided under CFD arrangements. Since these ROC levies are governed by statutory legislation rather than contractual agreements, they can be cancelled with ease. We would do so at once, reinforced by an Act of Parliament, without breaching existing contracts or exposing Britain to reputational risk. The alternative is to continue forcing obscene energy costs down the throats of the struggling British public. For a time, we would also make a point of publishing the figures for monthly subsidies spent on renewables, so that the British people are kept maximally informed during the transition away from net zero. The two major metrics should be the total cost of subsidised energy and the cost per average household. As with any phenomenon as architectonic as energy, there are knock-on effects for the rest of life too. So-called Energy Performance Certificates, EPCs, are a case in point, made mandatory by the British state. These are assessment tools that give an energy efficiency rating for every building across the land, whether upon construction, sale, or rent. The idea is to make sure that our built environment measures up to the grandiose scheme of social engineers in Westminster, when in reality they achieve nothing of practical value. EPCs are costly to obtain, so these costs are invariably passed on to the consumer. Landlords are effectively forced to spend money implementing energy upgrades, for if they fail to do so, they risk having their assets removed from the private rental market. This is a particularly devastating dynamic for the government to foster within such a sector. Because so many young Britons, already disinherited in countless ways, have come to depend upon a competitive market and plentiful stock among landlords in order to bring down their monthly rent. Needless to say, EPCs, also have dramatic implications for factories and other industrial buildings, with significant compliance costs for anyone productive and engaged in constructing, selling, or leasing non-domestic properties. Under a Restore Britain government, EPCs would become entirely voluntary, to be brandished as a unique selling point to potential buyers, tenants, or leaseholders, as and when property owners wish. It has been estimated that over time, this could save the non-domestic sector up to £33 billion, if not more, in meeting top-down dictates at the expense of the needs of industry. EPCs should then be based on a property's insulation features alone, not net zero related values. While not technically related to our binding net zero commitments, the Carbon Price Support (CPS) mechanism, designed to punish fossil fuel use, would also be scrapped. It needlessly burdens industry and makes Britain uncompetitive. One major challenge in the way of eliminating net zero related costs is the fact that past governments, as well as the present one, have already made us hostage to certain contracts with renewable providers, locked in at high prices for a period of 20 years. We should do everything in our power to rescue taxpayers from footing such irresponsible liabilities agreed by previous governments. But it is also vital that we act in good faith and maintain business confidence. The task to navigate ways around these contracts will therefore have to be subtle. Reform UK has committed to striking down contracts awarded in Allocation Round 7, which is to say those struck in the last 12 months. Alas, giving advance notice of one's intentions to rip up a contract does not automatically render the matter non-justiciable. To think otherwise is naive. Our alternative strategy in the case of wind farms would be to invoke existing laws for the protection of birds and other animals to address the well-established harm caused by 200-mile-per-hour turbines. We would impose a windfall tax above a certain threshold, as well as a legal duty on all wind and solar farms to restore any land under management to its initial pre-installation state, right to the very foundations. On the positive side, we would explore opportunities to give contract holders a financial stake in the success of more reliable, scalable, dispatchable sources of energy, oil, gas, nuclear, that a Restore government would favour. As a last resort, Restore Britain's Great Clarification Act, GCA, first presented in our mass deportations paper, would also provide helpful in dissuading costly judicial review efforts and batting away disruptive court decisions. This would establish a two-track correction bill process whereby, if triggered in response to some controversial court decisions, no more than a simple majority in the House of Commons is required either to give legal force to non-judiciable government dissent from the ruling or to ensure straightforward repeal of the laws, sections and or subsections cited by the controversial ruling, so that the government may continue its policy unhindered. Another challenge we face is that much of our legislation covering net zero extends into existing trade agreements, some of which incorporate them. Our post-Brexit Trade and Cooperation Agreement, TCA, with the European Union is one such example. The TCA affirms cooperation on carbon pricing and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. It also contains non-regression clauses included to deter either Britain or the EU from backsliding on net zero commitments, as the TCA itself specifies, in a manner affecting trade or investment between two parties, so as to give unfair advantage. Unilateral repeal of our own binding net zero aims could in principle be met with trade retaliation or simply sour our relationship. A potential silver lining, however, is that the relevant clauses within the TCA are more general aspirations than strict obligations mandating specific policies. Since it is not feasible to attempt everything at once, we shall do our best to minimise friction with the EU. Bad blood is in neither of our interests. We would therefore begin by seeking sensible amendments to Articles 391, 392 and 764 of the TCA. If, as seems highly probable by the 2030s, there are like-minded governments in France and Germany, the two major powers within the EU, this will be far easier to accomplish. Across Europe as a whole, too, it is gradually dawning on national elites that dogmatic net zero targets are a luxury that can no longer be afforded. By the 2030s, that realization will no doubt be further advanced as the economic damage reaped by such policies becomes more apparent. But if European leaders nonetheless feel in the mood to pick a trade war with Britain and hurt their own struggling economies in the process, simply because we dare to pursue our energy interests, as indeed the Germans have done by reopening many of their coal-fired power plants, that is their prerogative. Given our trade deficit with the EU, it will harm them more than it harms us. If waged anyhow, our efforts to adjust to the economic volatility will be eased by our having abandoned the self-harming net zero crusade, which threatens long-running structural damage to our national prosperity in a way that no temporary trade dispute can. We have never said that restoring Britain will be a painless endeavour. More reliable sources. In the early decades of the 21st century, securing Britain's energy interests could not be more crucial. Long a source of oil for the developed world, the Middle East is undergoing an uncertain shift in the balance of power, with potentially troubling consequences for the energy-generating infrastructure of oil-rich Gulf states and freedom of navigation in those parts of the sea. The Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, even the Suez Canal, through which tankers carry the goods to many shores. This drives up global prices, hitting even those countries that import their oil, as we do, from other places like Norway and the United States. This in turn translates into higher costs for consumers, both industrial and domestic, and expensive energy hits not only private profits but general productivity. It does not take any expert knowledge in geopolitics to realize that the Middle East is prone to conflict. We are therefore wise to insulate ourselves from the consequences of such periodic convulsions, so that whatever happens in this notoriously volatile region, among others, inflicts no grave impact on Britain. A mere 2 decades ago, we were a net exporter of energy. Those days are gone, but a Restore Britain government would get started on a long-term strategy to bring them back. Our decision rule is simple. Projects and policies will be judged against a single test. Do they increase the volume of reliable energy available to Britain at a lower system-wide cost? If yes, they shall proceed. If not, they shall not. Anything less can no longer be tolerated. To repeat, energy must first and foremost be cheap, reliable and scalable. Our own installations are back to front on the matter. Whereas in 2000, the vast bulk of Britain's installed energy infrastructure was built to accommodate coal, oil, gas and nuclear, nowadays these sources have declined dramatically as wind and solar have risen. That is a problem because long before human ingenuity unleashed the power of latent first in fossil fuels and then in the atom, we already had ample sunshine and ample wind. But crucially, these energy sources, insofar as they could be harnessed, exercised control over us. The magic of oil, gas and nuclear is that, in their different ways, these sources put us in the driving seat. It is therefore in Britain's long-term economic and indeed civilizational interests not only to maximise our supply of dispatchable sources like oil, gas and nuclear, but to minimise our dependence on intermittent sources like onshore wind and solar. This is the opposite of what we have been doing. A note on planning, the fourth fundamental. First, we must remember that energy alone is not sufficient. There is a fourth variable on top of human energy, biological energy, and industrial energy that determines whether or not abundance in these three domains translates into national power: the ability to build. A nation may possess a capable population, plentiful resources, and cutting-edge technological know-how, but if it cannot turn these inputs into power plants, transmission lines, factories, housing, ports, railways, and data centers, then that nation's economic potential remains unrealized. The capacity to build is increasingly the dividing line between growing and stagnating economies. Modern China's advantage is not simply that it produces large quantities of energy. It is that it can erect infrastructure at a scale and speed that has become not just difficult to replicate, but unthinkable in many Western countries. That said, infrastructure projects in Britain are not constrained by any law of nature, nor are they hampered by any dearth of technological knowledge. Our economy increasingly fails at the build stage because of countless regulatory burdens. Common patterns include decades-long planning timelines, litigation-related delays, and environmental review loops. As a result, projects that should take 3 to 5 years instead take 15 to 20. These constraints are increasingly apparent in emerging sectors. The rapid expansion of artificial intelligence, AI, for example, is already encountering a basic physical limit: a shortage of electricity. Large-scale data centers stand in need of enormous quantities of power. Efforts to bring them online can take years of regulatory approval before a solitary watt is produced. The extortionate cost of energy is also deterring the development of such hubs across Britain. A £30 billion project was recently dropped because it proved too expensive. Restoring national capability, therefore, requires more than simply investing in energy production. It requires restoring the institutional capacity to build infrastructure at scale and high speed. The obstacles to build fast and at scale are both regulatory and institutional. As for the institutional roadblocks, under a Restore government, the Charities Commission would already be made more directly answerable to ministers. As such, the very worst green lobbyists, if entitled to tax breaks, state funding, or a seat at the policy-making table, can and would be deprived of all three. The regulatory roadblocks are more particular to each power-generating sector, so they shall be treated for the most part on their own terms. For the time being, let it be said that we would not hesitate to invoke our aforementioned GCA whenever we believe needless planning hurdles to be obstructing Britain's vital energy interest. A so-called rule of positive silence, under which statutory consultees are required to make their protests known within a short defined period, or effectively waive their right to object later, would also be a wise way to deter the most frivolous forms of lawfare. Otherwise, urgent projects get bogged down further by delays. Our practical approach focuses on several principles. First, strategic infrastructure must be treated as a matter of national capability. It therefore cannot be subject to criteria identical to that which governs ordinary planning disputes. Approval timelines should be measured in months, not years. Second, regulatory frameworks must be simplified. An alarming number of delays arise not from environmental or health and safety protection itself, but from overlapping layers of approval, consultation, and litigation that cause projects to stall for indefinite periods on end. Third, infrastructure policy must prioritise abundance. Electricity should be as plentiful and as affordable as possible through a balanced mix of generation sources. We favour offshore oil and gas, nuclear fusion, onshore hydrocarbons where available, and unsubsidised renewables integrated into a stable grid. Last of all, governments must recognise that the physical economy matters. The digital and financial sectors are important, but they ultimately rest upon human energy, biological energy, and industrial energy. When these foundations are strong, innovation flourishes, and markets allocate resources efficiently. When they are weak, economic policy becomes a matter of managing scarcity instead of enabling growth. Oil and gas. Due to a determined crusade against oil and gas drilling and exploration at home, Britain has now developed a needless dependency on energy imports. Worse still, much of this comes from Norway, a country that has the sense to take advantage of the very same oil and gas reserves in our own backyard, no less, that we continue to neglect. Licenses are withheld and projects are shot down by judicial review. Meanwhile, the British Isles are situated on billions of barrels of hydrocarbons, waiting to be extracted from rocks below the waters of the North Sea. But whereas Norway drilled 49 exploration wells in 2025, Britain drilled none. This tells in miniature a decades-long story. In Britain, there has been a steep decline in North Sea oil and gas production from the 2000s onwards. In the same period, the Norwegians have carried on making the most of their geographical good fortune. If we were to restore Britain's domestic oil and gas sector, then as well as enjoying ample supply at home, we can once again become a leading exporter of oil and gas, in all likelihood to a ravenous global market, happy to pay higher prices than exist even now. Indeed, we used to be a net exporter, but no longer. In addition to undermining Britain's energy sector, another problem with dependence on imports is that it means our own struggling economy receives no benefits in the form of investment or employment. 80% of direct oil and gas jobs remain in northeast Scotland. It is feared by those on the ground in Aberdeen, a crucial node in the sector, that on present trends workforce numbers could plummet from around 115,000 today to as low as 57,000 by the early 2030s. This adds up to 400 job losses every fortnight. That is before we even account for jobs indirectly connected to oil and gas, around which so much of Aberdeen's economy is based. This part of the British Isles blossomed amid Middle Eastern turmoil in the 1970s. A Restore Britain government would work to replicate much of this boom amid similar chaos in the region today. Green zealots claim that the North Sea is a declining basin, that most of the gas has already been extracted, that the majority of what remains is oil, and that we export much of that oil in any case because it is not the kind used by our 4 remaining refineries. Our view is that it is always worthwhile to hunt for new oil and gas, not least because, through AI, such efforts can now be enhanced to make exploration even more targeted. We already possess a formidable North Sea data bank built from 60 years' worth of activity, which, with the help of AI, can now be processed at extraordinary scale and speed for fresh leads on the whereabouts of any remaining oil and gas. A major downside to our elite-led renewables drive has been reflexive hostility to oil and gas. The geopolitical situation in the Middle East today only reinforces the need for greater oil and gas capacity at home. We have just 12 days of gas storage, so it is absurd to act as if making the most of our own backyard is not sensible. By comparison, the Netherlands has 123 days, France has 103 days, and Germany has 89 days. As for the complaint that much of our oil is exported, why should that count against exploring and drilling for more? Whether oil is sold or used for domestic energy needs, if it has come from British oil fields, it is contributing to our economy. If Britain were to take no interest whatsoever in all commodities that are priced on the international market, we should find ourselves neglecting an awful lot besides oil and gas. It makes no sense to display such arbitrary contempt for the energy gold right under our nose. Homegrown production stimulates investment, boosts the sector, and brings supply lines closer to home in the event of global volatility. As distinct from oil, gas is in fact less transportable, or transportable only at significant cost, so there would be a home advantage and therefore greater security. We are a gas economy, but right now remain far more exposed to the global liquefied natural gas, LNG, system than we need to be. Last but not least, oil and gas still accounts for as much as 70% of Britain's energy lifeblood. New licensing for drilling and exploration must therefore be granted. We cannot be confident that the North Sea supplies are slender as it is claimed, if we are forbidden from exploring the seabeds. Norway discovered fresh reserves off its coastline as recently as last summer. It has already made 2 noteworthy discoveries in 2026. Yet, even after Labour's heavily qualified partial climb down, the government remains hostile to oil and gas exploration. Its so-called North Sea Future Plan reintroduced limited licences only. So long as this additional production does not require new exploration and is already part of our links back to existing fields and infrastructure. A Restore Britain government, meanwhile, would reward exploration as well as drilling. Among other things, this means taxing the sector at a competitive international rate. On that front, we would bring an end to the Energy Profits Levy, EPL, imposed first by Conservatives in 2022, since increased by the present Labour government and due under Ed Miliband's obscene designs to be made effectively permanent by a so-called oil and gas price mechanism. As a Jobs Foundation report puts it, what was supposed to be a brief windfall tax on high energy profits amid the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war is in danger of becoming a permanent fixture. Unless we reverse course, Britain will soon be the only country in Europe with a windfall tax on oil and gas profits still in force, scaring off investment and undermining our energy needs. Instead, we would impose no more than the standard 25% corporation tax, not the effective 78% grabbed by the Treasury at present. Right now, the incentives around even the small amount of drilling that is permitted remain extremely forbidding. In the year ending July 2024, the average rate of return for offshore operations stood at a pitiful net -1%. Our aim, by contrast, is to foster a predictable environment that rewards investors. We would also look into establishing a system similar to the Norwegian one, whereby profits from oil and gas are returned to some sovereign British wealth fund to be invested elsewhere. Norway's entire pension scheme relies on this model. A similar arrangement in Britain could prove an effective way for us to dig ourselves out of the extractive welfare system in place at the moment. But we would also level with the British public. There are no overnight solutions to the way in which Britain has been woefully misgoverned in recent decades, including on matters related to energy. It will take time for a revival of oil and gas drilling and exploration to lower prices, not least because many of our gas turbines are approaching the end of their service life. There is currently an 8-year wait on new gas turbines because the entire world is dashing to embrace dispatchable energy and we find ourselves behind the curve. 2 oil fields in particular, Rosebank and Jackdaw, could be pumping out oil by autumn if given the go-ahead. Rosebank is fully operational, would produce 70,000 barrels of oil per day, half of what we import through the Gulf. The process would be further accelerated across the board if, as Restore Britain favours, we followed Norway in allowing operators in the sector to make their upfront investment costs tax deductible. Even so, the drilling and exploration components of oil and gas are simply the initial source of dispatchable energy. They do not convert it unto themselves. This is the role played by power plants. To account for the looming closure of some of our gas turbines, we shall have to do two things. First, we would pursue life extensions where viable. Secondly, we would not hesitate to make use of coal in the interim. That would involve building new coal-fired power plants. The major advantage of such plants is that, as well as being dispatchable, they can be up and running within a shorter time frame, roughly 3 to 4 years, than gas turbines. As both China and Germany have shown, modern techniques also make coal far less of a pollutant than it used to be. Last of all, there is plenty of it, particularly the cleanest and densest anthracite and bituminous varieties across the British Isles. As for getting oil and gas out of the seabeds, much of the drilling is ready to go. There is no shortage of institutional knowledge and depth. Exploration by nature will take a little longer to bear fruit. All the same, sending the right signals to operators is tremendously important. If we fail to begin soon, we shall have to begin later.